All right,
Okay, so we are
very
good to
good.
go. Thank you, Greg.
So I see Steve DePoe on the call. Steve, ICA was founded in 2011, I think. Yeah, and of course you were a driving force behind that, and we are both founding members. Although Steve has done a lot more work than I ever have with IECA, for which we're all grateful. But Steve and I had a conversation. You might remember this, Steve, back right around 2013 or 2014, where we raised the idea of IECA getting involved in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change process. And Steve deserves credit for getting us in. We worked together to get an application in, but for an organization to have access to the United Nations climate meetings, that civil society organization or non-government organization has to be accredited. And you have to go through a relatively lengthy and thorough vetting process or application process. So many thanks to Steve for the work that you did to get us there. We were accredited prior to the Paris meeting in 2015. And of course, you know that if you paid any attention to the inauguration yesterday, President Trump now is going to pull us out of the Paris Agreement once again. He hasn't answered my letter urging him not to, but that's another conversation for another time. But 2015 was IECA's first presence at the COPs, and we had a good team of people there. Phaedra Pizzullo was part of our team. Annabella Carvalho was part of our team. Number of people were there who may be names that you know well in the IECA community. So we have participated in United Nations meetings ever since, and not just the COPs, but we participated in what we call the intersession meetings, or sometimes they're called the subsidiary body meetings. And those are meetings that occur for 2 weeks in the middle of the year, typically in late May or early June. And Ruta and Jesse and I have all been at meetings in Bonn as well. So I'll encourage you to speak about that as well. I'll say this about the COPs, and you've probably heard me say this. Some of you have heard me say this before. If you've never been to a COP, and one of my students, Lexi Fitton, is on the call too, and she was part of our gathering in Bonn. So Lexi, you might have some comments to share as well. But if you went to one of the COPs, the way I explain it to people, imagine a carnival, not a circus, but a carnival. And under one big carnival tent would be the negotiations themselves. And we as an observer organization can sit in on those. We cannot talk. We cannot participate except passively. We can take notes, but we're observers, so to speak, in the back of the room. That's only part of what happens at these COPs. Under another tent will be what we call side events. And Ruta and Jesse and Maria have all presented at a side event, and you might want to speak about that. But a side event is a lot like a conference event. So if you go to ICA or NCA, and you're giving a paper as part of a panel, it's somewhat similar to that. People aren't not necessarily giving formal papers, but there'll be a lot of PowerPoint slides, and people will give 10 to 15-minute talks, and then there'll be question and answer opportunities. So that's the second. Under the third tent will be exhibits or booths, and IECA has always had one. We partner with Mediators Beyond Borders International, which is another organization I work with, and we kind of think of them as our cousins. And we will submit applications and then merge those applications, and we've always received a booth for at least 1 week. We had it for a week in Baku. We had it for a week in Dubai. So we've been fortunate to have a booth at all of the COPs. So that's the third one. The fourth one will be the pavilions, the fourth tent. And the pavilions are run typically by countries or also well-funded NGOs. So for example, the United States during the Obama years and the Biden years had a pavilion. They won't under Trump because he's pulling out of the Paris Agreement. But Indonesia is one of my favorite pavilions. I love going to the Thai pavilion. I usually can find a little bit of free food at the Qatar pavilion, and the coffee at Canada is pretty good. So you go to the pavilions, and at the pavilions, again, there are presentations. I've been fortunate to present at the Indonesian pavilion in the past, at the United Kingdom pavilion in the past. And again, you'll have sessions there, much like the side events that are approved by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The events at the pavilions are controlled by the people who host, or the countries and organizations who host the pavilions. Then the fifth is what we call a hub. And Ruta and Jesse and Maria and I have all been involved in the capacity building hub. And that is about a 7-day program of, again, presentations, activities. And I've been fortunate to be asked to serve as the kind of modalities advisor to the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, to work with the hub so it becomes more participatory and more interactive. So if you think of those 5 big tents: negotiations, side events, exhibits, pavilions, and hubs, that's what it's like. And I'm going to stop there, because I think Ruta and Jesse and Maria can all speak what it's like when you go to one of these things for the first time, and then to talk about, to what extent is communication even addressed at meetings like Baku or Dubai. So I'll stop there. And certainly you can write questions in the chat, or certainly I'll leave it to Valentina to moderate if people want to come on and ask questions of any of us at any time.
Yes, we want to keep it as a conversation. So whenever you want to participate, either raise your hand or write the question in the chat. So I think one of the first questions is exactly what you said, Greg, at this very end. To what extent communication is embedded or seen as important in this type of events? And maybe any of you can give us some experience. Maybe you were shocked that nothing was, the communication was not even mentioned, or what is your perspective on this take?
I can say. So, firstly, thank you for having me here, and hi to all my team and to everybody. I'm very excited to to participate in IECA events, because I'm very thrilled to to know better people from whole world. So it's every time an opportunity, a big opportunity for me. So I think, Valentina, that everything is communication. In COPs, in Bonn, conferences. So there are a lot of messages. There are a lot of visual and oral and other types of communication. I, as a practitioner, I can bring to Lithuania, a lot of messages and a lot of knowledge from these conferences. So I can use in my practice after these conferences. I really can, talk about topics that are on these conferences. So I can be involved in, other events in Lithuania and be, as a speaker, as an expert. So it's for me, it's everything about communication. For example, I remember my first time of, it was in Bonn 3 years ago. And I just came for 5 days, and I'm probably was happy because it was not in a real COP, but it's in smaller one. And even even though it was so many of everything, that I think that we even haven't had a time to meet with all our team, because I just wanted to be and participate in everywhere, in negotiations, in side events, in events, in exhibitions, and even on rallies that always are doing NGOs. So we are from Ringo, from research and okay. How it is abbreviation? Exactly. Research and intergovernment organizations. It's right. intergovernmental.
Ringo is the research
Yeah.
and independent NGOs.
Independent NGOs, yeah. So, a lot of NGOs, they're participating and pushing. So they are doing their communication activities because they should, they should push politicians and, push their agenda and receive some kind of good result during this negotiations. So I even participate on these rallies because it's interesting for me. I'm not just practitioner that communicates about climate crisis issues, but also I'm from NGO sector, so we are organizing rallies here in Lithuania. So I even learn how to organize rallies here in Lithuania in a more better way. So, but okay, a little bit from my side. Let's. I just want to hear from my colleague side what they are feeling.
Yes, or Maria would like to share?
Yeah, hi everyone. It's great to be here with you all. I think I will just kind of echo a little bit of that. I think obviously communication to me is just fundamental to these conferences. I think that if you've ever sat in a negotiation, one of the most interesting things is how much time they will spend on the wording of every bit of that document. So you will see like, we can't say unabated, we have to say unabated fossil fuels. We can't say there's just so much detail in terms of the language because every single thing that goes into that document is going to be like potentially like guidelines that they have to follow in terms of those kinds of decisions that are made. So they spend a lot of time and there's a lot of brackets. And so basically when a country like wants something in, but nobody can agree on it and it's like put in brackets, like there's just so much detail at that level. So I think for that reason alone, like there's just a lot of communication. I think also one of the big parts of the conferences is that because civil society cannot participate, your only way to really have as much of an impact is through two kind of ways. One is to kind of indirectly build relationships with negotiators and talk to them. And so that's like a really key part of it is like those relationship building. I know Greg has done a lot of this over the years and I'm sure other colleagues have as well. But a huge part is, yeah, building those relationships and trying to kind of like influence that way. And then the other way is really through those indirect mechanisms of those side events and those different connections that you make outside of it. So I think for that reason, also, it's very important. But what's really interesting, and Greg can speak on this a bit more, and probably Maria and Ruta as well, but we have found that when we try to bring up the importance of communication and really emphasize the fact that there should be better like modes of communication and better mechanisms for increasing participation, there's still like this resistance and this like I think just like desire to continue to kind of communicate in the ways that they're used to. So there's oftentimes maybe we kind of talk about the need for new kind of like more participatory modes of communication and more participatory modes of process to get more people involved. And we've tried, I know Greg has tried a lot to talk to the Secretariat about this and to just increase our presence and increase our impact. But I think, they'll have these, world cafes that Greg will be the first to tell you is not an actual World Cafe. And, they'll have these mechanisms that they say are going to be more participatory, but oftentimes don't really and get as much participation going. So a lot of these events, especially side events, end up being people kind of talking at the audience and there's not as much engagement. So that's something that like I think IECA continues to talk about is like how can we have an impact in that way because for us, communication is simultaneously the content of what everyone's talking about at these events, but it's also like the way that we're doing it in the process. And so, one thing that I think these events could really think about more is just how to like diversify the process and get more people participating and engaging so that there are more chances for that relationship building and kind of being able to have more of an impact. So that's kind of what I think. I think there's like these two parts where I think that their communication is fundamental, but I don't think that they realize how fundamental communication is.
And I might add something about that as well. Hi, I'm Maria, and it's really nice to see you all. Happy New Year! And it's maybe I have seen some of you, I have not seen some of you. So I'm from Indonesia. So back then I was in the booth a lot. Like the first thing first, when I came in, I directly go to the booth and I stay in the booth. In the booth, we hang some poster talking about, we had some posters talking about what is IECA. I put some poster about COSI and things. I put some of our course also in the booth, the poster about the course in the booth. And then I get a lot of people coming to the booth and asking, okay, what are your organization is doing? That's always the first question they ask. And then I have to like, I think I already like super expert in explaining what is IECA and everything there, because like I do that like thousands of times every day. I was there for 7 days this year, last year 2 weeks. And one thing that is really interesting for me is that first, there's a lot of people not knowing what environmental communication is and how we do the environmental communications and why it's important and everything. And second, what I feel and I get from a lot of conversation is that also there's a lot of communication, environmental communication practitioners, specialists, or things like that, that don't have the platform to share experience like we do like now. That's where I then promote IECA. Okay, let's join IECA, click this link and be a member and things like that. But then I see that IECA is really interesting for them, because then it is a platform for us to share about what we are doing about these kind of things. And because I think out of a lot of booths, the one that is talking about communication, I think not a lot. And maybe like that's why we are so interesting for them, because then people started to see that, okay, communication is something that is really important, but we still don't know how to do that. So yeah, that's one of my points.
Thank you, Maria. And I'm going to read some of the comments that have been written in the chat. And the first one reads, we see communication as fundamental to the work of climate change negotiations advocacy. But do the other participants take a step back and reflect on the importance of communication as a skill and also as a field of study and practice? How can IECA play a bigger role in centering communication in the COPs?
Well, let me answer that a little bit, and also just mention, and Jesse and Ruta and Maria know this, as does, I know Steve, you know this as well. I've been to the last 15 of these. So I've been to the 15 COPs, and I've been to 15 intersessions. I've been to over 50 United Nations climate meetings. And I've seen a shift in communication over those years. If you went back to 2009, when I first went to Copenhagen, or even back to Kyoto when I first started teaching about the climate negotiations, the term communication appeared in something called a National Communication Plan or National Communications Plan. And that basically meant that countries were obligated to, especially developed countries, were obligated to report to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat what they were doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that was it. You had a national communication plan. Communication wasn't addressed much. Science communication, climate change communication, that has shifted over the years. And one of the big areas, and I would Google this if you're interested, if you Google Action for Climate Empowerment, ACE, that was in the 1992 convention that came out of the Rio Summit in 1992. It's Article 6 in the old convention. Article 6 today means something else, but back then it was basically about participation, awareness. You can read that. Well, that evolved into Action for Climate Empowerment, at which point every country was asked to come up with a focal point within their government, within their negotiation team. But a lot of countries haven't, particularly developed countries haven't. I went to an ACE workshop right around the time of the Paris Agreement, and there were about 60 countries there, and maybe 3 of them were developed countries. In the developing country world, there's greater attention paid to communication, particularly when it comes to things like adaptation. And those of you who follow this closely know that in the developing world and in many of the countries of the global south, adaptation is more important than mitigation. Well, how do we do adaptation without good participatory communication? And to that point, Maria and Jesse and Ruta have all given presentations at side events at these COPs on different aspects of communication. So ACE is a place where we've made some inroads, and I participate in some of those meetings. It also means that you do this informal networking. There are 9 civil society constituencies in the process. We are a member of the RINGOs, the Research and Independent NGOs. They know who IECA is. Maria's absolutely right. When you work at the booth, you get all sorts of people coming up with questions. You give them your business card or you give them your QR code. You get into a conversation. And just as a case in point, I'm currently in conversations with people in Pakistan who may bring me over to do some training. And Steve and I had conversations about a year ago with some people in Uzbekistan, where we were able to persuade a program in Uzbekistan to change its name, its master's degree name from environmental journalism to environmental communication. So the networking is very informal, but there are also opportunities to present your work. Maria, Ruta, and Jesse have all worked with me at the Capacity Building Hub. But it's a continue, in a way, I'll put it this way. I don't know about it, your universities. I've been at Oregon State University 38 years. Forestry people, ag people, science people, public health people, they say to me, oh, we've got to work with communication. The English department doesn't say that. The history department doesn't say that. I get more support for my field, for our discipline outside of liberal arts than at least at my university, than within it. In a way, we see some of that same experience. When I talk with people from the US delegation, they may be interested in communication to some degree, but my friends in Bangladesh are incredibly interested in it. So we can make inroads, particularly in the developing world. And Maria, you're in Indonesia, which is, of course, I would say in one of those emerging economies, you're kind of in between developing and developed. You might want to speak to that as well, but those are just some random thoughts.
Thank you,
Maybe
Greg.
not random, but yeah.
So we have another question here, and it's Jesse mentioned about the importance of words in negotiation, and I was curious about whether this is done in one official language or in multiple languages. And in case it was one official language, what impact might that have on those who do not have that as first?
This is a great question, and I think there's kind of like multiple answers to this. On the one hand, like a lot of the negotiations, they do have like translators, but usually the only languages, and Greg can probably correct me if I miss one, but it's French, Spanish, and English. Is there any others?
I know that Russian
Oh, yeah.
is also.
Yeah, Chinese and Arabic. There are 6 official
Yeah.
UN languages, and the big plenary sessions, you have headphones and you can get any of them, but the documents are in English.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's like one of the things that I think about a lot is access issues because there have been people, we even had an event and we just didn't have anyone there to translate. It was like the capacity building hub and they didn't have any translators and someone came up and said like this is really inaccessible, we can't like be part of this. So I think that that's a running issue is that the translators are very inconsistent. So like they're not going to be at every event. So obviously for the high plenary events and things, negotiations and things, you'll have that, but they won't be at some of the others. And then also people who like want to participate have to learn one of those 6 languages in order to be able to participate.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here, and it reads, here in Brazil, we're thinking that the link between communication and education, communication, can be strategic to strengthen the importance of environmental communication, also in COPs, and to spread research and practice speaking more participatory modes of communication. So do you think that the Greening Education Pavilion and the climate justice movements can be spaces for the IECA to act at COP30?
Jesse, I'm going to turn it over to you. You've been working in the field of just transition and climate justice. you want to talk about that? I want to encourage Maria and Ruta as well. And I also want to plug a wonderful student of mine, Lexi Fitton, is on the call. She was with us in Bonn. May want to address this through the perspective of the Youngos, which is the youth constituency.
I can maybe speak to a little bit of the climate justice part, but Maria, you might have some stuff to say about the education components. And Lexi, please jump in at any point if you want to add some things. I think for me, the climate justice part for me is the part that I'm most invested in when I go to these conferences. I think that there are so many ways to participate, and then also to talk about kind of what we do. So this year in Baku, there was this media display. And so a bunch of climate justice organizations got together, and basically they put together this pay up sign, and it was in the stadium. And so we all stood there and we held these like signs up, and it was like this big, just like media demonstration. So what's interesting about the climate justice kind of component is that it's really dependent a lot of times on the country and the spaces that they allow for those movements. So, for example, in Baku, there were, there were protests, but ultimately the kind of demonstrations had to be contained to specific areas. Same with the UAE and Egypt. I think Glasgow was pretty exceptional, maybe not because I haven't been to too many, but in that there were protests all outside. There were so many events happening. And what was really cool about Glasgow is they had the COP26 People Summit for Climate Justice. So there was all kinds of events happening throughout Glasgow on different kind of climate justice issues. And I ended up going to a lot of those and found them like just a lot different in terms of the kind of conversations that were happening there versus what were happening inside the COP. So I think when it comes to climate justice, yes, I think that that's been to me one of the most important spaces to be part of, but it really, how that looks really just depends on the year. But ultimately at every conference, the UNFCCC will allow for these kinds of protests and these different kind of organizing to be happening, but it has to be in certain locations. So you have to make sure that it's a UNFCCC like has given permission, and it has to be isolated to a specific place. But yeah, so I think that for Brazil, that's definitely something that we're thinking about, and it's going to be interesting to see how that compares to the other ones in the past couple of years, because I'm hoping that it will be at least a lot more climate justice presence, and we'll be able to be much more participatory in that sense. But Maria, and do you want to talk about the education component?
Yeah, sure. Actually, the question like whether the Greening Education Pavilion can be the space for the IECA to act at COP30, and the answer will be of course. I mean, like every pavilion is the way we can advocate the environmental communication, climate change communication. And Thais, you're from Brazil, so this year might be your years to show up there, because I don't know whether I can go to Brazil or not, but then the networking, the like what Greg said, the formal and informal networking is something that is actually be the way to then make IECA can be seen everywhere. Like this year, I had the chance to be panelist in two like really random sessions. One is about sustainable tourism. I was talking about the community engagement, and so in the Casa Brazil, in the green zone area, and in the green zone in the Ministry of Tourism Brazil. And then one other event that I was speaking as I was in the Korean pavilion. I was in the Global Youth Climate Coalition event, I think, GYCC. And then it's the previous COP in Dubai, I was talking, because of Greg, I was talking in the Uzbekistan pavilion, also talking about environmental communication. So I mean, like the informal and formal networking is really important to then we can find our way to somehow present or somehow be a panelist or somehow participating in any event, and then advocating about the environmental communication. Because then I got that chance because I was in a WhatsApp group of early career researcher. And then they were asking for, can someone help me talking about this? And because I had that kind of experience, I messaged them, and then like suddenly, okay, I was being a panelist in that. So I think that kind of way is, I don't know, there's no specific way to be a panelist there. Then you just need to find your way. But then once you had the chance to participating in any event or be the panelist, then there will be our showtime to then saying about the importance of environmental communications.
I just want to add that, I think that our team, we use all possibilities that we can find to talk about communication. For example, this year in Bonn, we have press conferences. I think that 2 of them. So in Bonn is easier to organize press conferences. So Greg, you know better. So and it is a possibility just to talk what's going on specifically in communication field. About how is going on about communication in specifically in conferences. So in another events we can also talk about communication, but in a very more sophisticated way. For example, gaining capacity and so on. And so it's not directly about communication and theoretical things in communication. So just I think that we are trying to use all channels, all possibilities we are seeing when we are there from insiders, perspective.
Thank you, Ruda. There's one question in the chat, but before going to that one, I think we're touching, and I'm hearing like several topics are when you're in COP, they're talked about, and I hear adaptation, climate justice, or just transition. So based on your experience, what trends or topics are emerging as critical for environmental communication in this type of global climate forums? Because at the end, it's also important for us as communicators to understand what terminology we are going to be working with, what is what trend. So what can you say about this?
Well, I'm actually really new in this field. So when I first in the COP in Dubai, I was really like trying to navigate myself among all this just transition, loss and damage, adaptation, mitigation, health, and I forget what, and then everything, and then global stocktake and everything. There's so many themes, and the last emerging themes and the themes of the COP29 last year was the climate finance. So they were all talking about climate finance, how to finance the environmental or climate change action, and also like some kind of, Jesse know better about the pay up things. Of course, the fossil fuel phase out versus phase down and everything. There's a lot of new thing emerging, but yeah, the latest was climate finance. But then one thing that's also we were talking when we were there, there's a lot of buzzword there, like the words empowerment, empowering, resilience, and every session is using that kind of words. So then it's really hard to navigate. Meanwhile, you have to separate the buzzword and the real action somehow. Ruta, Jesse, and Greg can also add some, because then we were talking about this kind of buzzword a lot, and they do a lot of, like, they do all beautiful title for their sessions, and when we are in, they're really not talking about anything. So that's one thing that is really hard to navigate when you are there. And then because I'm really new, I just been to 2 COPs. For me, navigating things is really hard, because then you have to really be careful reading about all the, Greg is knowing all the history, but because I was only on 2, it's like, the theme is keep on going, and then you need to like separating the buzzword and the real conversation.
Let me add a couple of things to what Maria and Jesse and Ruta have been saying. and this is really partly in response to James' question in the chat. If you want to get involved in the UNFCCC process, without having necessarily to go to Belém or Baku or Sydney or wherever we go, first of all, go to do something called Google Ringo, RINGO, UNFCCC, or Ringo Climate Change. That is the research and independent NGO constituency. It doesn't cost you anything to join. You get on their listserv, you get all of the emails that come from our Ringo focal points. And so you just get a lot of information on United Nations meetings. One of the things that might be interesting, now some of you know Mariah Russo Kelly, who is an IECA member, and she's at Southern Connecticut University. She started within the Ringo constituency an oceans research group. So it's people from all over the world who are focusing on research related to oceans and coastal policy. There's no reason why there couldn't be a communication, environmental communication or climate change communication research group that could get started by any Ringo member. And it doesn't require you to go to Belém. It doesn't require you to go to Bonn. It just, you become part of this, and people do Zoom meetings and they do email traffic. That could be really interesting. The second thing I want to mention is that if you decide you'd like to go to one of these meetings, we are accredited, and I am the focal point and the designated contact person for IECA, which means I allocate badges. So when Ruta and Jesse and Maria join me in Baku or in Dubai, we all have an official badge that has our picture, says International Environmental Communication Association. You can't get into the conference, the blue zone as they call it, unless you have a badge, and the badge has to come from an accredited group. So again, if you're interested in Bonn, Lexi was there this last year as part of our team, and Ruta and Jesse been there as well. Or you're interested in a COP30 in Belém, you obviously will want to pay attention to announcements that come out through Valentina, where you nominate yourself, and then we try to make sure that everybody who wants to go is able to go. The last thing I'll mention is that in addition to the Belém and Bonn, there's something called the constituted bodies. And the constituted bodies are committees that get a lot of work done. One of the newest ones is called Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, where just transition, climate justice is discussed. I've been an observer at every meeting of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, and I go regularly to Bonn to participate in the Adaptation Committee meetings. And when you go, you don't have to go like me and travel as much as I do, but if you're interested, you can participate virtually, or you can participate in person. What's interesting about the constituted bodies, whether it's the one on loss and damage or the one on climate finance or adaptation, you get to talk, you get to participate. It'll be a 15-person committee from all over the world, and then there'll be 20 observers in the room or on virtually. And once the committee members have discussed an agenda item, then they'll say, do we have comments from observers? And it's that way that I became the modalities consultant to the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, because I'd been at all their meetings, I'd contributed ideas. Now they call me Professor Greg or the communication guy, and you can have access to the UN system through these standing committees, and your ideas, your expertise, your curiosity will all be respected. So.
I just want to kind of go back a little bit. Thank you, Greg, to talk a little bit more about some of the conversations that are happening. And then this also probably answers James' question, because I actually go to these events because of research. So I'm really interested in both the kind of like climate justice movements that are happening and kind of how they're organizing within these events, but also some of the climate injustice concerns that come up with a lot of the negotiations and the kind of solutions that are being put forth. So I think kind of building on Maria, I think there's a lot of conversations around climate finance, specifically last year because there was the new quantified goal on climate finance, which is basically like there are these like different components of it. One of them is loss and damage, which is this idea that countries who are the most responsible should pay loss and damage for the countries who are experiencing the most impacts. There's also things around just recognizing that countries, again, who are the least responsible, have to handle both kind of the like trying to transition, but also trying to, of course, build energy systems that address kind of energy inequities. So there's a recognition that they also need finance. So basically, it's trying to get certain countries to agree to a certain goal. It was woefully inadequate in terms of what they agreed to, but ultimately, that was a big stream. The other conversations happen a lot with Just Transition because there's now the Just Transition Working Group. What I find most interesting about Just Transition is that is a term that really does come from activist communities, but has been taken up in a very different way. So if you have the US talking about Just Transition, you have it solely being about workers. If you have, like, for example, the UAE talking about Just Transition, it's about sustainable development. If you have like countries in the Pacific talking about it, it's about the need to kind of end fossil fuels and start phasing out fossil fuels and thinking about other systems. Climate justice communities are kind of talking about it similarly, but also thinking about what are we building and what kinds of new systems do we want to think about and replace. So I think it's like there's just a lot of layers. And what's really interesting is that a lot of times negotiations will take up these terms and use them in particular ways, but they will kind of co-opt them, if you will. And then I think another really important stream that I will never understand, and I think Greg can kind of speak to this as well, is Article 6. And so those negotiations are around market-based solutions. So it's like carbon markets and carbon offsets and things of that nature, which consistently are very confusing negotiations. And they can't seem to ever really agree on them, but they continue to be like prevalent every single year. And then, of course, there's the global stock take, which is really more about kind of like assessing the ability to meet certain Paris Agreement goals, and then are we on track? And that's where you had conversations around phasing down versus phasing out. And then there's this unabated fossil fuels, which is basically like allows for geoengineering. And so basically there's just so much happening. And I think the hardest part about the first time you go to COP, it's just learning the language that they're using. And that takes quite a lot of time, is to figure out what are the negotiations, how are they talking about these things, in order just to be able to sit and understand what's happening. And then once you have a little bit of an understanding, every year, like it's going to shift a little bit. So one year, I think at the UAE, there was a lot more emphasis on just transition, and that was happening a lot in activist groups. But then in Egypt, it was really big on loss and damage. And that was like the year that we got the loss and damage fund passed. So what's also interesting is that each year, even though these negotiations are happening, like from the climate justice perspective, there will be like one particular thing that people will really organize around. And even though they'll be talking about other things, there will be a lot of movement building to really push that. So anyway, those are just some conversations. I think Ruta can probably build on that as well.
So I probably can add from totally, practitioner perspective, how I, prepare to go to these COPs. I actually follow some journalist communities, and they are preparing before these conferences. They just doing events for journalists, and they just, I can, be on these events and just understand what's going on, what is relevant for them, and how they are preparing to communicate. For those who don't know what I'm doing in Lithuania, so I run climate news agency in Lithuania. I write articles and public releases and send to journalists to be published these articles in news portals. So therefore, for me, is really relevant to know, what is interesting for journalists could be. And of course, I understand that, probably in all countries, not just in Lithuania, journalists are not very well educated in this topic, and we do not have a lot of, especially environmental, in environmental communication, dedicated journalists. So I can just imagine that what I gain in COP conferences. So I can, put in my articles, and then all this, things, all messages, they just appear in the news portals in Lithuania. Therefore, it's really important to, to prepare, to be prepared, to know better everything. And still, I don't know everything. I know all abbreviations. I learn, by heart each year, from the beginning. So I even have vocabulary of these abbreviations. And but very, very interesting, to observe that vocabulary in this COPs also is changing. For example, this year, in several events, I have heard new concept, Mother Earth, and it was, oh my God, totally overwhelming for me, because I just realized, if I put this word Mother Earth to use in my articles, probably nobody will publish my articles in Lithuanian. Just just we we communicate in some kind of liberal field of communication, uh, very narrow global, not south, but global north perspective. And when I participate in COPs, I have broader worldview. And when I use, I always should choose what kind of wording I should use, what kind of concepts I can use, that it could be published in Lithuania, because yeah, okay, not all journalists, as I already said, that they understand. So, and I always try to be an activist and push my own agenda, because I want to communicate and educate. So I want to do edu-communication. Good word was written there. So and I try and I do this edu-communication through my articles. Okay, so a little bit.
Thank you, Ruda. And as we head into the final part of this meetup, I mean, we have so many questions and comments, and I think it's just a projection of the interest and of these global events and what we can do. So I would just like to finalize with one question. And what do you think are the opportunities that you see for IECA to expand its impact within the Ringo community and future COPs? Because how can we move forward? And I'm asking as an association, by thinking that we have all of this interest, all of these members' interest in this type of events. So what are the opportunities that we can have?
Well, I'll give a brief answer. One, obviously, you can participate. You can participate in the COPs. This last year in Baku, we received 10 virtual badges. So there were 10 people who could participate without ever having to spend travel money. They just had to get up at weird times of the day because of the 10, whatever the 10, I think it's a 12-hour, 10 or 12-hour time difference. So you can participate virtually. You can attend any of these meetings. And if so, you respond to my call for self-nominations. We try to get you a badge for 1 week or 2 weeks. That's certainly possible. But the other thing I'll mention, and a lot of you know this, and the comment is in the chat, we all know that there are so many organizations now working on climate change. Some are within a government or a bureaucracy like CC Learn, which is affiliated with the UNFCCC. You could Google that and see what comes up. But there are a lot of NGOs that are very interested in this. 350.org, for example. Greenpeace has communication specialists, and you can make inroads there independent of the UNFCCC process. But if you go to one of these meetings, either in Bonn or in Belém, it's just as Jesse has done and Ruth has done and Maria's done. You don't simply focus on the negotiations, because if you do, you get a little discouraged. Because trying to get almost 200 countries to agree to something is a huge challenge. And then you have countries like the US with Trump that are pulling out, and we get asked a lot of questions about that. What's happening with crazy politics in the US? But there are so many things, organizations outside of the UN system where we can really make a contribution. And then you can sometimes get access to a COP, not just through IECA, but through the Sierra Club or through Climate Reality or through Greenpeace or whomever. And it really almost doesn't matter. Ruth has helped us out a lot, because you've been able to get badges from the Lithuanian government when the IECA badges have been few and far between. So we do everything we can to get you there to Bonn or Belém if you want to go to one of these, but it's not the only way to participate. So I'll leave it to Jesse or Ruta or Maria or Lexi or Steve. You've been involved from a distance in these things for years as well. And of course, I credit you for getting all this started.
Thank you, Greg. Would anyone like to add some final comments?
Okay. I think it's really important, like what Steve actually mentioned here, and a lot of people also, some talking about what we can do to center the communications part in the COPs and everything. Then for the next maybe SP60 or COP, we can have this kind of meeting first to like brief, and then after that the brief what has happened, because a lot of times, of course, like what it's been talking also in the chat, that after the event, then it's suddenly like gone. Like we forget everything. We don't really like reflect and everything. So then my hope or my suggestion for this next meeting like this, whether it's SB60, COPs, or we have also COSI this year, that before that we can have also a monthly meetup for those who are going or who are not going but want to be participating. I've also know that Greg keep talking about proposing for the side events that have the short period window of time. Maybe we can talk about some of the things that we want to do there. And then like, because for example, for me, traveling to Belém would be so impossible because it's so far away and so expensive. It's from Indonesia. But then I can still be contributing in centering IECA in the COPs, centering communication, and then make IECA heard in the COP. Because then I believe that we have a lot of great people here, a lot of academician practitioner that have good models on environmental communications, concepts, theory, or whatever it is. And then we should be able to then deliver that on this kind of meetings. So then it will makes communication more understandable for them. And then also, yeah, I think, I mean, like everyone in the IECA can contributing, even though they are not coming to this kind of meeting. I think that's what I want to add. Yes. And
Steve? Yeah.
Yeah, hey, friends, just to say, the rationale for creating IECA in the first place, to delineate the difference between this organization and other academic organizations, is our ability to get involved in international conversations outside of the so-called ivory tower. And this, the work that's been done up to now has been fantastic. I think we have a lot of opportunity to do more, you know, in the next 10 or 15 years with the young leaders that are on this call to keep it going. So if you're interested, you know, if you haven't joined IECA yet for 2025 or renewed your membership, please do that to help us stay viable and, you know, participate in this type of activity for a long time to come. This has been one of the best meetups we've had so far. And I do think we should have some follow-ups both before COP and after. So,
Yeah.
but thank everyone for coming. I'm stealing Valentina's thunder there, but
If I may jump in briefly and do a bit of self-promotion, I've been a teacher for over 50 years, and I'm retiring at the end of February from Oregon State University. Next Monday, the School of Communications having a little event for me. They're going to have a reception, and then I'm going to give what we might call my final lecture. And the title of it is called Just Transition and the Human Dimensions of Climate Change. And I'm hoping to get it recorded and then put it on my YouTube channel. And you're all welcome to watch it and give me feedback on it, because the human dimensions of climate change, and these are things like culture, indigenous knowledge, collaboration, communication, are not mainstream in these UN negotiations. They've elevated, they've become more important. Gender, for example, 15 years ago wasn't even addressed. Now gender is a mainstream issue in the negotiations. And the other thing I'll simply mention is that even though I'm retiring from Oregon State, I'm not retiring from life, and I'll continue to stay involved with the UN system. You're always welcome to email me, jump on a Zoom call one-on-one. If I can ever, if you'd like a conversation more about this whole experience and how you get involved and what you might or might not do. So again, a little bit of self-promotion. I don't typically do that, but thought I'd let you know that this is a very timely thing. And I endorse what Steve said. We could get together more often to talk about these issues, not just on the UN system, but just the role that researchers from IECA can play and activists in conversations about the climate crisis.
Well, thank you, everyone. And out of this meetup, there's this proposition to start a working group for the COPs within IECA. So I will circle back with Greg and let's see how we can make it happen within the organization and try to keep it as smooth as possible and inspiring. I think that's what we have to do here. So thank you very much. I also want to say again, if you have not renewed or if you want to know more about IECA, you are always welcome to write me and I can give you more information or how to do this process of joining IECA or renewing. So thank you everyone, and have a very nice day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you and bye.
Bye.